Hello and welcome to this special event with Karen McCarthy Woolf as part of Well Versed, a collaborative programme led by Open Book and Stanza International Poetry Festival. We run 3 sessions each month focused on the same featured poet, all on Wednesday lunchtimes. The first session is a chance to read and discuss some of the poet's work, guided by one of Open Book's lead readers. The second session, which today is one of, invites the poet to read and discuss their poetry with us, as well as provide a chance for you to ask your questions. And it is being recorded so we can enjoy it at our leisure later as well on YouTube. The third session, which will be happening in a week's time, is a creative writing session, inviting participants to write in response to the work that we've heard, again, guided by an Open Book lead reader. So I think this is just a wonderful opportunity to do that deep dive into a writer's work. And look at it from different angles. And I like that the poet's in the middle as well. So you get a little bit of, coming up with your own thoughts and responses. And then you get to sort of ask the poet and then get another layer of appreciation. So I'll introduce Karen and I'll hand over to her in a moment. So she will then give us a lovely live reading. I will ask a few questions and then I'll put it to you to ask some questions as well. So this is Karen McCarthy Woolf, FRSL, who was born in London to English and Jamaican parents. Her verse novel, Top Doll, which we'll be talking about a lot today, was shortlisted for the T.S. Eliot and Jallock Prizes, and she is the winner of the 2025 Jerwood Prize for Poetry, England. Welcome, Karen. I will pass over to you. How are you doing today?
I am good. I'm not in London where I usually reside. I'm actually up northish, I think, at Lumbank, the Arvon Centre. There's a little bit of snow on the hillside here. Yeah, so that's me, and I'm very good, thank you.
Good.
Really excited to be here.
Yeah, well, I'll pass over to you for us to have our lovely lunchtime reading, which I think is just, yeah, I'm just always delighted. So thank you so much.
Cute. Okay, so I think what I'll do is I'm going to read just a sort of couple of poems that were in the handout, and then I'm going to sort of read mainly from Top Doll today. But the first book I'm going to read from is my first collection, An Aviary of Small Birds. It came out in 2014. It's a book of elegies to various people. But the sort of principal event that the book is focused around is the death of my baby son who died during the childbirth. And so just to give you that sort of context for the book. And I think it's a book that has very deep connections in nature, in the natural world. And I think that might sort of shape a little bit about, sort of what we think about today, and how it's sort of how we approach it in very different ways. So I'll start with Wing. We find you, dear Wing, in the half dark, on the way back from the piglets, your knuckle of raw bone and streak of claw white quills torn from the socket. A grey goose soars up high where hot air balloons drift, and the wind is a shape to wrap yourself around. Solid but unseen, a somersault inside the womb. Here, folded to a cup of hands, plump as a wood pigeon in the long, flat January grass, you are singular and intense, like a girl breathing quietly by a window, her just cut hair pressed against the glass. Yeah, it's strange. Synchronicity is a thing I think about a lot in all my work and all my process. And at that time, I saw a huge amount of roadkill. Yeah, it seemed to congregate. I'm going to read now, and often birds actually. Yeah, sort of perhaps hence the title. Portrait of a small bird on a tree of 12 meters. And this is after an artist, Giuseppe Pannone. And there are a lot of ekphrastic pieces in the book. And this is one of them. And the title is actually the title of the artwork. Inside, where it is dark, where branches crisscross, a tree stripped and whittled, where the wood is denser, and leaves flicker like bonfires lit at the end of summer. Here, in the heart of the wood, you are the light, not the shadow, an unsolved equation in a dog-eared exercise book. Cross the red line and the room changes size, dimension. The ceiling reaches for a lightning spear, wreaks havoc on a rectangle of artificial daybreak, while a rusted girder snaps at a toddler on the bus. Everything I want is up there, just out of reach, in the white emulsion. And I'll finish with this little aviary bit. Actually, as we were talking about snow, I realized, oh, I put a little bit of snow in aviary. I was very interested at the time in the letter form, and I started a correspondence with another poet, Miriam Nash, who was running a sort of kind of course on sort of snail mail and about being slow and about being offline. And that was what I needed at that time because I was in this moment of trauma and very deep grief. And we had this beautiful and amazing correspondence, and we have all those letters. And this is a poem. Well, it's probably a sonnet looking at it. This is a poem that I wrote from one of those letters, or sort of around letters. It's a letter poem. It's called Letter to Miriam. Forsythia buds nudge their way through snow that betrays its promise to make everything unknowable and melts. I think of you and Rue de la Croix d'Or, Van Gogh's chair and other yellowness, pollen and bee stripes, sherbet lemons and egg yolks, 40-watt bulbs. Right now, I have an urge to go swimming at the oasis, where genies of steam rise from the warm water. My thoughts are scattered. What of the other life where I skin buffalo and snore by the campfire? Who holds my son now that his feet have been cast? Why here? When more than 1 billion birds spiral out of the sky each year, why don't we see them fall? So, some questions for Miriam. Yeah, so those are some of the Avery poems, and I think one of the things that happened when I was writing in Avery's Small Birds is that I realized that I kind of like, there are lots of poems in that book about being in water, about being on water, close to water, and I found it very healing. I found it very comforting. And I thought about why that might be, and I was thinking about how the kind of bereavement of sort of losing an infant is always very unexpected. We expect them to outlive us. And I realized I was clinging on to things that I thought were certainties. But obviously you can't spend any amount of time by the sea or on the sea or, whatever, without thinking about what humanity is actually doing to it. So my next book, Seasonal Disturbances, and you've got a couple of poems, I think, from there in the handout. You had them. That's really a sort of book. I mean, I sort of think a little bit like in Avery, I was trying to make a very intimate grief universal. And in Seasonal Disturbances, I'm trying to make a very universal grief around ecological crisis, kind of really as a of capitalism. And I'm thinking about trying to make those losses more intimate. So there's quite a lot in the book sort of around reversals and things like that. And I'm just going to read, I might just read outside actually. sorry, forgive me. It's on page 66, here it is. Outside is a little sonnet, and it made me think, I wrote it just sort of one day in London, looking at queues of people outside the Apple shop. Outside under the arcade and the floor-length glass shop front, a green pop-up dome flanked by a Burberry suitcase and a sleeping bag. A makeshift shelter for Cy from Stratford, with time to invest in a 4-day queue. He's first in line for an iPhone 6S. No one moves him on or threatens arrest, as it's not about where, but why you pitch your tent. No. And I'll read just a little one. It's called Happiness. I sometimes get people to vote for this, but yeah, I'm just going to read Happiness. It's a found poem, actually. I don't know if anyone will know the form, but anyway, I'll read it. Happiness. When one locust meets another, the nervous system releases serotonin, causing a mutual attraction, a prerequisite for swarming, serotonin, causing a mutual attraction. The nervous system releases when one locust meets another. Yes. So kind of locust life. I kind of love the fact that, you know, the locust plague is probably the worst thing that people can ever imagine. But if you're a locust, it's just this huge ecstatic frenzy. Anyway, I told my friend this and she said, I've done some more research into this, Karen. And I said, really? She said, yeah, then they all have sex and then they like basically kill each other and bite each other's heads off. And I was like, oh my God. Okay, so that's locust life, but they seem to love it. And they are also inhabitants of the planet. So voila, that's seasonal disturbances. So I'm going to read a little bit from Top Doll now. And that'll probably be the rest of the reading. And the thing I wanted to say, I suppose, about Top Doll is that, you know, most of my work focuses on, you know, sort of thinking about nature, what is nature, our access to nature, about my experience of that, growing up in London my whole life, being a Londoner, of all these many things. And then I ended up, you know, then I ended up doing a PhD on it. Then I ended up writing a book about a woman who hasn't left the house for 80 years. And I was like, wow. So I ended up in this very deeply agoraphobic space. And Top Doll is a verse novel. Has anybody here read bits of Top Doll, by the way? Have we got, okay, we're all newbies into the Top Doll space. Susanna, you have, amazing. What I would say is that, Top Doll is the story, kind of a woman called Huguette Clark, who died aged 100 and I always forget she's 104 and 105, whatever, you know, 100 and in New York in 2012. I learnt about her through her obituary. She was one of the richest women in the world. Her father made his money in copper mining mainly. She had various traumatic bereavements in her life and was a kind of shy woman, possibly, I would say maybe she was on the autistic spectrum or 100% yes, but it was all undiagnosed. And she had this terrible marriage in the sort of 1920s. It went badly wrong. She got divorced. Her husband claimed non-consummation of the marriage. And she spent more and more of her time, and this had been happening, you know, sort of like really since childhood. She really just sort of like retreated from the world, spoke to very few people apart from her mother. Her mother died, you know, sort of in her sort of late 40s, 50s. Anyway, she spoke to very few people apart from sort of like people she had to, her accountant, her lawyer. And her collection of dolls. So Top Doll is a book that tells this story, but in writing for me, somebody that lives in America for 100 years, for nearly the whole of the 20th century, part of the 20th, the whole of the, almost the whole of the 20th, part of the 21st, that becomes the story of America. And when I started to do the research, I realized that Huguette Clark had very few black dolls. In fact, she had no black dolls. And I thought, well, I am a writer of color. I am a black woman. I'm not going to tell this story with no black dolls in it. And I'm also not going to tell this story without any indigenous voices. And so, and for part of this time, I was actually living in LA when I wrote this. So I was thinking a lot about the settlement of the American West, and I was thinking about America's identity as a sort of settler nation. And that's actually the subject of my next book, Unsafe Poetry, but we'll come to that perhaps in the questions. And I'm going to read, this is a polyvocal novel. There are many different poetic forms. We've got ABCDeries, we've got haibun, which is a prose poetry hybrid, which Japanese porcelain speaks. We've got Dolly, who sees herself as top doll, and she speaks in kind of like crowns of sonnets in a hybrid between in a kind of hybrid sort of French English. There are biographical reasons why she speaks this French, okay? Because Huguette Clark's mother was kind of half French. Anyway, so that's Dolly. And we've got all the Barbies who speak in these ABCD poems. And then we've got two rag dolls. One is called Miss Ting. She's Jamaican. She speaks in patois. And then one is called The General. And The General is kind of like, it's funny because he's the only male voice in the book, but he's almost everybody's favorite. So The General is the only doll that has spent time, a significant amount of time, outside of Huguette Clark's apartment where all the dolls live. It's a 42-room apartment. It overlooks Central Park, Park Avenue, because Huguette Clark was very rich. And The General tells his story of how he came to be living in this apartment. And he tells it through a kind of like a rendition of how he gets his name. And he's writing his memoirs. It's a long intro, I'm afraid, but there's a lot of context to give you, and particularly as poets. So I'm actually going to read some of the prose section. He writes in prose because it's a memoir, but it's a very highly stylized voice. And behind that voice, I really had, the ghosts. And I think in all writing, we have ghosts of what's gone before. And I kind of had the ghost of the great sort of slave narratives, Oladua Equiano. I'm thinking about the sort of prose essayism of James Baldwin. But I'm kind of doing it in also quite a playful way, because after all, this is just a little rag doll. Okay? And I will tell you that the general starts his life on a slave plantation in Virginia. And he's made for a woman, a real life woman called Eliza Brown. And Eliza Brown was a runaway. And she ran away and she became General Custer's cook. So there's a little bit of fiction and there's a little bit of reality. So I'm just going to read a little section from that, and we'll see how we're doing for time, if I can read any more. The General. Reminiscences and recollections of General Obadiah Louverture Little Rock Yellowbird Jr. II. A memoir. General Obadiah Louverture Little Rock Yellowbird Jr. II. That is my full, unabridged, and endowed name. and it is a hitherto undisclosed fact that the general as referred to is not George Armstrong Custer, the gonorrhea-ridden Union Army officer with whom Eliza found her life entwined, but another more appropriate warrior, Toussaint Louverture, general, Jacobin noir, and revolutionary extraordinaire who had led the incarcerated of Haiti into that historic and victorious rebellion all those centuries ago. He who liberated our land of the high priestess Mannequin clan, where the veil between soft flesh and dull hive was worn thin as any hand-me-down Sunday best, where a fat moon blazed its path through tavern windows in flickering candlelight, as marauding pirates and press-ganged sailors swigged draughts by the dozen, blind to the true identities of the grinning revolutionaries and buxom maroons who surrounded them on stealthy reconnaissance, so as to gather muskets and coordinates through the intoxicated waggling of ale and rum-loosened tongues. This was a lush and prolific island where legions of martyr mannequins sacrificed arms, legs, lungs, and necks as cushions for carefully placed pins to help bring a nation of whip wielders to its knees. Grand Mammy Bessie stitched this history into my striped breeches and matching dicky bow from a worn waistcoat she'd wheedled out of old miser Price. Gollywog. I think not, my friend, for it is I, General Obadiah Louverture Little Rock Yellowbird Jr. II, who was the prototype. Those mawkish minstrels were a facsimile of me, of every black flesh-fashioned rag mannequin. It was Grand Mammy Bessie herself who collected used cloth, rags, and horsehair from the manes and tails of prized palominos with which to stuff me. She who haggled hard for those two matching ivory buttons at the haberdashery, as the top right corner of the back section in the general store was somewhat grandiosely titled. A little piece of Africa, she'd muttered under her breath, as the needle pierced her fingertip for blood that dripped upon the cloth, and she fastened tight the thread. There we go.
Wonderful. Thank you,
It's
Karen.
general. I always hoped to read a bit more for him, and then I sort of run out, and then I'm like, oh my gosh, prose is longer than poetry. We forget that.
Totally. What I was thinking was it'd be great if you have another poem we could do at the very, very end to sort of round off the session. Would that be okay?
Another poem.
Yeah, just at the end of the session, I mean. So like we have our
Oh, I
little,
see,
yeah,
not now, but at the very
yeah,
end.
we'll have our wee discussion, we'll get some questions
Oh, let's have a little
from the
thing.
chat and then round off with one more later.
Sure.
Fantastic. Um the first thing I wanted to really ask was about the kind of process of writing Top Doll, because to me that seems like you're having a lot of fun having all the different experimentations with the different forms and styles and speaking through voices. So I was just wondering if you could say a little bit about that. What was it like, the process of writing and the selecting the voices? How did you differentiate between the voices and all that?
Well, one of the things that really helped me differentiate between those voices was poetic form. Because I initially started with Dolly the porcelain. She's a sort of classic, this isn't really her, but that's a version of her that they put on the front of the book. But you know, there's classic sort of little frilly 19th century porcelain doll. And through Dolly, what I was able to do, because what I really wanted to do was to kind of like be very playful, but also kind of really send up this whole idea kind of like sort of white fragility. Oh, is this Susanna? She's asking me something. Is this a sort of something I should read? Anyway, white fragility. So I was very interested in that. Dolly sees herself as fragile, and she also, she sees herself as better than everyone else. But then, and it's kind of this idea that I sort of play with around mass production and being bespoke and handmade. And the black rag dolls are all handmade, they're black made dolls, and that's something the general talks about. And I kind of, it's funny when voices come for characters, because once you get that little first moment of the voice, then the character starts to lead rather than you as the writer. And that's an exciting moment. It's kind of that moment when you're writing a poem where you go, oh my God, the poem's in control now. The poem's leading. The poem is going to find its own solution. Yeah. I started just writing one Barbie kind of under duress. I wasn't really into it. And then I think actually Tishani Doshi had been writing some lovely ABC series. And I went, oh God, I'm going to try this form. And I wrote one Barbie in this ABC series, and I was like, oh my God, this is so much fun. I've got to do some more. And then I ended up, it was a very, very long, organic, iterative process in lots of ways. And so I ended up at the auction of Huguette Clark's actual dolls. Yeah. And I bought a doll at this auction. I couldn't buy Dolly because she was $28,000. And also a little bit scary. I love dolls, but I was a bit scared of Dolly. I'm not going to lie. She looked fierce. Anyway, it wasn't my place. That wasn't where she was going. I feel like there was a sort of spiritual destiny for all of those dolls. But Lady Mamiko did come to me, and I bought this Japanese porcelain, and I wrote the character Lady Mamiko in the haibun, which is, I'm sure people know, a prose poetry hybrid. It mixes sort of sections of travelogue with a little haiku at the end. It was invented by Matsubasho in The Narrow Road to the Deep North. And that seemed an appropriate form in which to sort of playfully write Lady Mamiko's sections. And then yeah, I mean, I think, yeah, so poetic form is the answer. I did a huge amount of historical research. And remember, I'm looking at the whole of the 20th century in America. So sort of narrowing it down was one thing. And what I also found was I had these moments with the general in his narrative where I had to get him as an inanimate being from kind of A to B. So he starts with Eliza Brown, but he has to end up on the road with General Custer. And the reason he starts with Eliza Brown is simply because during my research, I'd seen this very, very enigmatic photograph of Custer, his wife, Libby, and then Eliza Brown in the background. And I thought I'd got to know more about her. And I want to tell her story. And so I thought, well, the general can be with her. That's great. And so that's his foundation story. But he needs to get into Huguette's apartment in New York. And so in real life, Huguette's father went kind of in around, I think it was in the 1870s, he kind of went on this sort of like rather horrible mission, sort of in the Indian Wars, tracking down, kind of indigenous people who were kind of fighting back. Anyway, and in the story, he brings back the general as a trophy. And he finds him because the general has been on the road, because he leaves Custer and he goes, I was going to read that bit, but there's not enough time. But he leaves Custer and he ends up with a woman who Custer took hostage. And he becomes the doll of their son. And then he's lost again. And so it's this sort of case of being lost and found and ending up in different places. So yeah, hopefully that gives you a little, it could honestly go on forever talking about it because there was was so much
Well,
research.
that's it. You've got the whole, as well, the whole of the world. You're not just researching a particular time, but you're, researching forms from different places as well. Like that, that's just fascinating. And I'd seen somewhere that you'd actually use Google Translate as a bit of a tool to get some of the like kind of faux, almost French voice. I was wondering if you could explain how you use Google Translate as a tool, because it sounds kind of an interesting way to play with language and see what happens,
Yeah, I mean, this was well before the AI era as such. I
Mm.
suppose now people might think of it like that. But um, when was I writing? Yeah, well, anyway, yeah. Um, I really just wanted to get um, for Dolly. So Huguette Clark's mother was sort of half French, and Huguette Clark grew up in Paris. So her early years were in Paris. It was very much this sort of en vogue for the wealthy classes in America, and they would have a French governess, or they would go to Paris, all of these things. So, and I also had in the back of my head a friend of mine who is French, absolutely fluent in English, but her grammar is totally chaotic. And so, oh, Angelina Jolie's here. That's nice. I'm just seeing someone come along. Anyway, so I had this this kind of very chaotic French grammar sort of in my ear. And then I started writing these sort of little sonnet poems, and I'd have a line of the sonnet, and I thought, oh, maybe there should be some French. And I thought, I don't speak French. I'm going to put it into Google Translate. And obviously, this hideous mess came back because it's a line of poetry. And, Google Translate is not very advanced, and it certainly wasn't then. And I'd get this line back, and I'd be like, oh my God, that's crazy. And then I thought, well, why don't I put it back in and then see what comes out? So then I would put the line of French back in and translate it back into English. And of course, it was almost gobbledygook. And then I would take that line, and that kind of gave me the sort of grammatical sort of bedrock, um, sort of destabilized bedrock that I was looking for. Um, and I used that to get the voice. And once the voice was in, I didn't really need it anymore. And of course, I was working in the sonnet form. I mean, initially I wrote about 10 crowns, coronas of linked sonnets, which would have 15 sonnets. Um, per section. But I took most of them out. They weren't really relative, they weren't really kind of relevant in the end. I kind of wrote this novel very much like a poet. A novelist would plan out every single chapter, every single scene, and write very efficiently into this space, doing the research along the way. I approached it like a poet, going, oh my God, yeah, oh yeah, that's so great, that's so exciting, oh my God, wow, and that there. Let me take notes in, metered sonnets. Let me do that. Why not? Da, 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 da. And I kind of did it like that. But I think I just had so much fun, just like, sort of writing. All the agony was in the moments when I wasn't writing.
Isn't that the way? The only thing worse than writing is not writing, right? Um,
Yeah.
or yeah, that's the hard bit, isn't it? That's so interesting about as well. So you're basically getting to like pick and mix, and like you said, it's organic and iterative, and I think that really comes through, and that sounds like the dream way to pull a collection together, where you're getting to experience life and do research, and as things resonate with you, then you get to go and follow that trail and kind of put it in. What I would say is there are a lot of novelists that don't plan as much as you'd think. And end up writing non-sequentially, and which is funny. There's a whole other thing. But yeah, that as a concept, I think that must have been quite good to be able to say like I get to play with different things. And you were saying, you wrote all the different sonnets, and actually like a lot of them got discarded, but they were part of the process, I guess, the kind of creating process. And then now you're putting it together as more like a more of a show type thing. You've got performers. So soon is
Yeah.
Push the Boat Out, which is another poetry festival in Scotland, and you're doing it as sort of a show for that in Top Dod. Wondered if you could tell us a bit more about that as a sort of collaborative process, bringing it to the sort of stage.
Well, yeah, it's a scratch performance.
Okay.
It's at this festival, Push the Boat Out in Edinburgh, as you said. I will be. It's. I would think of it as a sort of musical illustration. I always felt that Top Doll somehow, and I think it's very much in Dolly's voice, is kind of completely operatic. It has this very sort of operatic feel to it. Sort of, but maybe not sort of kind of high opera. Um, anyway, I did a gig with a lovely event, Gravy, uh, in Crystal Palace, and one of the other performers was this musician, a multi-instrumentalist. They're called Carenza, and they make kind of synth pop folk. But literally, as soon as I saw them wearing a giant, kind of like a huge stuffed felt mushroom upon their head, singing a mushroom song, I went, "Oh my God, that's Dolly." I kind of also sort of they kind of like connected to the work that I was doing, perhaps because we're both quite eccentric in a way. And yeah, so we decided to get together and just see what would happen. And push the boats out, were excited at the thought of what might happen. And so that was kind of that was how it came about.
Gorgeous. That's yeah, that sounds so just fun. I think collaboration is fun, isn't it? And when they meet and what happens there. So I just want to ask a couple more questions, and then we'll go and look at the chat and we'll ask people that are here today. So I also came across something that said your poems were once dropped from a helicopter over the Houses of Parliament in a
Mm.
poetry bombing. What's
Yeah.
that? Tell me about that.
Oh,
How did that come about?
it happens. In 2012, you may remember, there was an event. It was called Poetry Parnassus. Simon Armitage, who's now the poet laureate, organized it with the South Bank Centre. And as part of that, they invited a Chilean collective called Casa Grande to come to the UK. Now, Casa Grande, what they do is they drop poems over cities which have experienced bombings. It's very connected to, Chilean history, to Allende, to Pinochet, to celebrating the demise of Pinochet and celebrating Allende as a man of literature. And they have dropped poems over cities from sort of Dresden and Hiroshima, many different cities that have experienced huge bombings, and also London and the Blitz. And so I had my poem An Aviary of Small Birds dropped, translated into Spanish, and then dropped as a little bookmark, and they sort of helicopter downwards. It's very beautiful. They sort of helicopter down from the sky. And I went to the one they did recently in Rotterdam, actually, and just experienced it without having a poem there. And it's really an amazing thing. And they were supposed to just drop them over the South Bank, but they managed a few kind of caught the gust, shall I say, of wind across the Thames and down the river as the helicopter passed by and dropped over Parliament, which I was very glad of, because I think yeah, maybe politics needs a bit more poetry.
Think so. What we'll do is we'll go. We've got a few questions. Yeah, and Teeny just said that's so beautiful, Karen. I think that just I really love listening to you, Karen. I think you've got really interesting mind and all the things that are thinking about and all the things you've researched. Like I always talk about like sort of creatives, especially writers, being like curators of some kind. You are away and living your life, and then you present to us your, here's my exhibition of my mind of what I've been like, thinking about or researching and
About it, yeah.
you know, um the first question is from Cara, and it says, "Can you talk a bit about what informs your choice of form?" So I think you've explained a wee bit, like the sonnets and Dolly, sort of kind of more classical and anything like that. But anything else you want to add about that? What informs your choice of form? How did you select some of the other forms?
Many different things will inform it, actually. Voice, register, tone, how the poem comes out. Perhaps you might think it's one thing and it becomes another. I don't see any poem as set. Probably the poems that I wrote most distinctly into the form. I would say that once you have a form, for me, Dolly speaking, a little doll, yeah, singing sonnets, a little song, the miniature, yeah, that made perfect sense. Um, equally, Barbies. Speaking in this A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, K, L, M, N, O, P. Every single Barbie speaks in that form because why? Because they're mass production, something Dolly looks down on. But they're mass production. They're iconic. They're archetypes. They're stereotypes. They're all of those things. And so for me, that seemed ideal. So they operate as a Greek chorus might actually. They operate as a chorus, but there are little differentiations. But they were very useful to me as a kind of literary strategy through which I could tell little bits of the story because it's a non-linear narrative. And so I sort of think of the Barbies storytelling as something that would be a bit like the glitter ball in the Barbieville disco you know, and each little ABCDE is a little tile on that glitter ball. So perhaps, Cara, that answers a little bit of the question. My new book, which I wrote at the same time actually as I was writing that, this is called Unsafe. It's out with Bloomsbury in February. And it's kind of like it's sort of like one long linked poem, sort of in this form called a Zuihitsu. It's a Japanese form, first emerged via the Pillow Book, 10th century Japan. Yeah. But what it does is it synthesizes many different narrative streams and brings them together into one. And so I think that's kind of that. It's got some sort of little pictures and things. Anyway, so that's the new book, and that's very much following on from aviary, seasonal disturbances, and this is thinking about again our access to nature. But I'm looking at it, I suppose, what you might call a carceral lens, to just be a little bit PhD-ish for a minute, which the carceral lens would be sort of thinking about. And it's interesting because it does relate to Top Doll, being stuck indoors, and carcerality being this idea of, having our movements and our freedoms limited. And so, macro politics are always something I think about. That character, the general, is also sort of a little bit based on my dad. And it's a very Jamaican thing. The way that he talks, the way he tells his story, the way he speaks of politics. In Jamaica, you might call it reasoning. And reasoning has many different forms. Some are more formal than others, but reasoning is a thing where, someone comes around to your house or a few people come around. If it was my dad once upon a yesteryear, he would have been playing maybe dominoes. The guys would come round and they'd put their world to rights. And you chat that, and you do your reasoning. It's political, it's spiritual. There could be some gossip involved as well, it's all of those things. And there's that voice and there's that kind of, my dad was a political activist. He set up the first Afro-Caribbean kind of talk radio station in the UK. And so, those politics have always been a really big part of my life. And the general was a way to sort of, get them out into the world a little bit. I kind of lost the question. What did you ask me?
No, I love that's what I like. I always people talking and then we go where we need to go.
Yeah,
Just ask about of choice of form.
yeah.
So we'll move on to the next one, which was you asked at the poetry school, MA summer school, can we use ekphrasis to
Yeah.
write about trauma, which is where you use art to write, yeah, to like use an art piece to write ekphrastic poetry. They've said, I think you can, as you do in Top Doll, as Richard Scott does through the
Yes.
medium of still life in his new collection. But as a
Mhm.
writer whose work also mines trauma, I'm interested to know what particular angle you feel
Fraser
ekphrasis
Springs, yeah.
brings to the exploration of trauma.
I'm going to mention a poet who I'm sure you'll know if that's the sort of realm of your work, which is Pascal Petit. Pascal Petit, as many people will know, um, that's her work is very, very trauma-based and very ekphrastic. She used to be a visual artist. She was a sculptor. And I actually in an aviary of small birds, I was attending, this is my first collection, I was attending a course that Pascal ran at Tate Modern, which was very much, and it was an amazing course because we actually got to be in the Tate Modern when no one else was really there and see all the exhibitions and have quiet, nice, not too busy time with the artworks. What I realized in that process, well, one is that ekphrasis, we always think of ekphrasis actually as responding to art, but actually initially ekphrasis was almost like a sort of form of notation in a world where we didn't have all the technology, in an untechnologized world, where we would say, here's the landscape, let me write it. Yeah. So it would include other things. But that, I mean, when I say landscape, landscape is an art-derived term. Anyway, so um, I feel that what you really gain from ekphrasis, and whether this connects to trauma or not is another thing, but I think it does, is you actually have, I mean, it's amazing. You have the artist's syntax. And, a visual art syntax is a complex, highly sophisticated, thing. And the artist has given you, and when you have that artwork, you have that syntax there. And it's the architecture of the work. So that's always there. And I've always found form to be very useful in terms of trauma. Yeah. And so the stronger the architecture of any of the piece that you're writing, the more vulnerable you can let that content be, because it has architecture, because it has structure, it has strong foundation. And so then you don't only have the formal structure of your own work, but you have that amazing syntax that the artist brings to it. Yeah.
Yeah.
And that could connect in a very sensory way. So you then have another whole sensory realm. I will say that one of the times I think I was really thinking about that, and maybe this is the poem to read on the out, I might read it on the out, but More Bleu, which is an aviary, was this moment where I realized also that, and this has been a very, very much a preoccupation in my work actually. I realized that, it's very easy for poetry or poets to think, yeah, here's an image, and we go, oh, look at that lovely image. I've made this lovely image. Don't you love it? Yes, we love it. It's set. But actually, and it sounds like a beginner thing, but sound, I have found, is one of the most profound portals to trauma and how we can express it. Sound, the sound of things. And I feel like, and music is a big part of my work. I'm not a musician, but music is a big thing in my life. And it has been for my whole life, and it will continue to be so. I've just written a libretto, actually. That's a very different thing. A libretto, it's called The Divine Feminine, and I'm kind of like in the process of invoking a lot of goddesses to come and sort this patriarchal shite out, as we say, in the libretto itself. Yeah, and see if we can kind of like, really help the planet, because I actually want my work to do something beyond just entertain and make us laugh, although that's hugely important. Make us laugh, make us cry, make us feel. But I'm like, can it do something energetically in the spirit of utterance? Can it do something? And I want it to be able to do that. And that is the work that I might be trying to do with trauma ultimately.
Beautiful. Thank you. Yeah, we had Niall Campbell here recently as well, and he's
Mm.
written an opera as well. So it's interesting to see that poets moving across the different spaces. We've got a couple more questions. We might not have time for every single one. So I'll just read the next couple. So the next one was, did any of the dolls surprise you or take the story where you hadn't planned? I mean, you already said it was kind of you were sort of letting them lead you, but did any of them surprise you? Says
Uh,
Melissa.
they all did in some ways.
Hmm,
Yeah,
hmm.
they all did in some ways.
Yeah.
Um,
And Philippa was wondering as well, because last week they read the Royal Barbie from England. So Philippa
mhm.
says, found it intriguing. Can you tell us a bit more about it as it felt different to the other poems we read?
Felt different to the other poems in Top Doll or the ones that you read in the.
I think probably the ones they read in the open book session, yeah. So
Well,
I
I
guess
think
maybe a little bit behind the scenes. Can you give us a little bit behind the scenes of Royal Barbie from England? It's a little bit more political, not more political, I say, but it's one of the if you remember anything about the process of that one.
it's kept its currency, one feels right now. Um, and like I say, I use the Barbies to tell a little bit of their era. The thing to know about the Barbies is that every single one in this book is a real Barbie, and it probably will kind of doesn't know anything prior, but particularly. But they speak to their archetype, they speak to their outfit, they speak, they tell you a little bit about what's happening. Because one of the things that's happening in the story, but I don't think we've really got time for that as such, is that the dolls, Dolly discovers that Maman has cancer, which she did in real life. And so she wants to try and cure it with this cherry blossom powder, which she finds on her bureau. But it's a finite resource, and all the dolls end up kind of involved in this kind of sort of crazy drug running scheme because they discover that cherry blossom powder has side effects that they like in the disco. Okay. So they all kind of comment on this kind of thing that's happening there. But with Royal Barbie from England, I suppose I wanted to kind of really, I used it as a way to perhaps critique the establishment. I mean, who could be more establishment than our lovely royals?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. So what would be great is if you could read us a poem to round off our session. Thank you so much for your time today, Karen. Like so insightful. Just yeah, lots to think about. Thank you.
Well, I'm trying to think if I read a different sort of Barbie because she'll fit the time scale. Um, and they all have the different things to say about Maman and the drug running and all of that sort of thing. Um, oh gosh, sorry. Shall I read Royal Barbie? Do people want to hear that, or do they want a different Barbie? Tell me quick.
Different Barbie?
A different Barbie. Okay, not Royal Barbie. Let's have another one. Okay, do you know what? I'm going to read. I'm going to read Christie. Oh, where's she gone? Christie's now hiding out. Oh no, here she is. I'm reading Christie because she's a historically significant Barbie. She was the first black Barbie, 1968. Imagine, 1968, all the excitement, all the, kind of revolutionary possibility of that era, which is what Christie embodies. But also, again, a little bit of the fun of the era, I would say. Is there anything that you need to know? No, I think that's it, really. So she's kind of like, Christie's commenting on Maman, and Maman is Huguette. They all call Huguette Maman, mummy. Okay? And this is Christie Barbie. And you might be able to hear the ABCs. I'll try and give you a little hint. And it's funny because when you do 10 of them, you're like, what am I going to do with a Z? And when you do 20, you're like, ah. Christy Barbie. Acid. LSD. 68 was a haze of tear gas, hash, leb, and black. All us cats wore their berries tilted, Che Guevara style. We were sisters of the revolution, you dig? I joined an ashram, sat cross-legged. I was gonna eat brown rice forever. Same way Maman only ate tinned fish and crackers. She could have dined on a dozen golden eggs by Fabergé a day. Not mashed potato in a hospital canteen or surviving on one yogurt. I just wish she donated to a real cause. Not bought jewelry she never wore nowhere. I'm a chick rocks a caftan. I taught Maman meditation, peace and love. She was into it long as no stud wanted to feel more than her mind. Not her crocodile wallet, neither. We had sexual liberation, free love, open relationships. Not Maman, She preferred life alone. Indoors, getting lost in time and space, quietly building Japanese castles, elaborate mazes. This rabbit warren went so far down the helter-skelter, Jack Kerouac skidded off of that freeway. You feel? Therapy could have helped. I mean, a daddy so rich with no understanding, he was one motherfucking bad vibes honky who hustled his seat in the Senate. What's Burns? They call it riots. Civil rights? Malcolm X was assassinated by the CIA. Vietnam, napalm. And Maman's yearning for her mama on harp. I played her Alice Coltrane. Zero interest. Geez, she's chic, but she sure ain't hip. There you go.
Wow, thank you. Yeah, zero. Nice said.
A little bit of Alice Coltrane in there.
Yeah.
You know, like I guess if we did that in the in the performance, we'd have to get a little bit of Alice Coltrane on harp, just a little moment in there. One of my favorite artists.
Thank you again for your time, Karen. This has been so just delightful and wonderful, and I can see everyone nodding and agreeing and with lovely reactions and stuff like that. So thank you again. Good luck for your event at Push the Boat Out as well. And sounds like a lot of fun. And have a lovely rest of the day. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much. And thank you for these lovely comments, which I adore. It's so nice to get this feedback. I actually just as quickly say, sometimes I'm like, oh no, not Zoom. But sometimes on the chat, you get things that you would never get from an audience, which people would never say in public what they will say in the chat, and ask you. So I love that. And thank you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, you're welcome. I'll stop the recording. There we go.